As we continue our discussion of labor demand elasticity in this module, let's finally take a look at elasticity and the relationship or effects it has with respect to total cost within a firm, and the elasticity effects that might be seen played out through unions and other types of labor contracts. First, let's remember that we're simply looking at applying microeconomic principles to the labor market. And most often when we think of elasticity, we're thinking about elasticity of price in the goods market, such that when the price rises, then we want to think about what happens to the number, the quantities, but we might also want to know what that does to the total revenues of a firm, because the price in the goods market is going to be part of the total revenues of the firm, the total revenues being the price times the quantities sold. Well, in this case, we want to actually take a look at total cost rather than total price, and we could do that because, yes, wage is the price of labor, but labor doesn't represent a revenue line for a firm. Labor represents a cost line for the firm. So the same rules that we're about to discuss applying elasticity and labor as a factor input with respect to cost will also apply to price and revenue for the goods market. So let's take a brief look at this. Let's give an example here to see where this takes us. And we're actually going to look at two different examples. One where we are looking at an elastic good, and one we're looking at a inelastic good. Both of these being these goods being labor, so it's a factor input. And we'll look at both of them with the simple formulas. Let's assume for a moment that we have an L1 of equaling 30. L2 at 25, W1 at, let's say, 8, and W2 at 8.5. So these are relatively low labor levels. We have seen an increase in wage. Commensurately, we saw a decrease in labor units. That would make sense to us because of the downward sloping labor demand curve. But this is probably a market for a relatively substitutable form of labor, a relatively low-skilled form of labor. So what will these changes yield for us using the simple equation? Well, let's run that equation. 25 minus 30 divided by 30, and that will be over 8.5 minus 8 divided by 8, which will then equal for us negative 5 divided by 30 divided by 0.5, so 0.5 divided by 8. And I'd prefer to look at that as negative 5 divided by 30 times 8 divided by 0.5. And that'll give us an output then of negative 40 divided by 15, or 2.66, negative 2.66, which is clearly elastic. Let's think about what happens here. If this is the case, we would expect to think that elasticity may have some effect on the total cost here. Well, I can identify the total cost. That's simply the labor units times the wage unit. And I can look at my total cost to begin with, and I can look at it after the price change. So when I do that, I'm going to have 30 times 8. That'll equal 240. So that's my initial total cost. So I'll call it TC1. And then we're going to compare that to some TC2, which will be 25 times 8.5, or 212.5, which we'll think of as some TC2. So we see that as the wage rose, that led to some actual decrease in total cost. So when we think about an elastic good, an increase in the wage in a market will yield some decrease in total cost for labor in that market generally. Let's now think about this with a different good, let's say a different type of labor. This will be a more highly skilled type of labor. And we'll think about this in still in terms of the simple equation. But now we have an L1 and an L2, a W1 and a W2 that are different. Let's say that L1 was equal to 50, L2 is equal to 47, and we have a W1 equal to 35, and a W2 equal to 37.5. So obviously a much higher level of wage, so we would expect that this would be a much higher skilled employee or worker. Well, let's go ahead and calculate this out using the simple formula. And we'll look at this and say that we've got 47 minus 50 divided by 50, and then all of that over 37.5 minus 35 divided by 35. And that would then equal for us some -3 divided by 50. And let me just go ahead and do the inversion now of this. Rather than write the equation out, just to write it out again, let me just go ahead and multiply this by the inverted here of 35 minus, and this will be 2.5, which is going to give us a value of -105 divided by 125, -0.84. So we know that this is inelastic. Well, let's see how this plays out in terms of total costs. We can take, once again, 50 times 35 for our original total cost. This is simply wage times labor, or in that case, labor times wage. And that's going to yield for us 1,750, and that will be our TC1. And then we can multiply 47 times 37.5, labor times wage, again, is our total cost. 47 times 37.5, and that's going to equal now for us 1762.5, which is our second level of total cost. So what we've seen is that as the wage rose, then it led to some increase in total cost. So for inelastic labor, or a labor unit that would be reflective of some inelastic labor demand for it, then we would see that as wage rises, total cost rises. And that makes sense to us from everything else we know. And it's just the opposite of elastic. When it is unitary elastic, then we would expect to see no change in total cost. So as wage rises, then that yields no change in total cost. And that makes sense to us because remember that unitary elastic is where we have the exact same change in wage as we have change in labor. So it's a percentage or a proportional change, which means that total cost is going to remain constant. So that makes sense to us. Now let's think about this with respect to unions and moderately or low or moderate skilled workers that are easily substitutable. Well, if you think about this, and we're now going to think not just in terms of the elasticity specifically, we're going to think about this in terms of what type of worker this is, maybe what type of elasticity that might be reflective of, and then how badly they may need a labor union and what this might mean to us. So let's think about this in terms of the low-skilled worker. We know for the low-skilled worker, highly substitutable, which means that we're going to have a greater percentage change in labor units than we had change in wage. So let's say that we are going to look at someone where we have an elasticity for this type of labor, elasticity, where it's equal to, let's say, 50% change in labor given a 10% change in wage. That would be a negative, so this would be equal to -5, which is clearly going to be elastic. Well, if that's the case, then we're suggesting that for highly substitutable, highly elastic labor, that as the wage changed only by 10% in this particular case, that we may have seen a 50% change in quantity of workers, which is bad news for those workers. Bad news for those workers. And these workers would absolutely perhaps benefit from some collective bargaining, maybe even some contract that was negotiated by a union, such that the contract not only negotiated an increase in the wage, but maybe it also negotiated with the firm some moderation of the labor units, such that they didn't let go 50%. Maybe they had to keep the same number of workers, so it buffered the effect of this decrease. If you also think about it, the labor union organizer may not be very excited about this, because if the labor union organizer goes and tells the workers, we're going to give you a 10% increase in wage through this negotiation, that's the good news. The bad news is 50% of you will lose your jobs. Then that may not be all that pleasing to the labor union organizer. And so maybe the labor union organizer is not that excited about organizing low-skilled, low-wage level employees. But they probably need that labor union influence more. They need the collective bargaining. They need some coordinated contract negotiation so that they can get an increase in wage without having to suffer perhaps an even greater decrease in the number of people that are working for the union. Let's think about this separately for an inelastic worker, and then we'll make some final comments. So an inelastic worker, we would have some inelasticity values such that we had let's say a 10% increase in wage, and it only yielded a 5% decrease in labor units. So this would be negative 0.5. Clearly inelastic, as we have suggested here. Well, in this case, this might be a labor union organizer's dream. You can offer to the labor union members a 10% increase in wage, let's say, that's been able to be negotiated by the firm, full well knowing that that's only going to yield long-term maybe a 5% decrease in workers. Well, that's a trade-off that might be acceptable. And if they aren't willing to accept that, it's not going to be as difficult to go ahead and negotiate with the firm a contract that requires that the firm keeps all those workers or keeps most of those workers. So it buffers this. So here's the dichotomy that's represented here. A labor union organizer may prefer to organize inelastic or workers for which there is an inelastic labor demand, because you can promise them a meaningful wage increase negotiated with the firm and know that there's very little likelihood of job losses, or the job losses will be minimal, and if need be, you can negotiate with the firm to buffer those job losses even yet. But on the other hand, inelastic workers, or workers for which there's an inelastic labor demand, are less likely to need a labor union organizer. They are not easily substitutable. So just by virtue of their skill levels, the lack of substitutability of them, they have some bargaining power with their employers even without collective bargaining, even without the influence of the union. Whereas just the opposite we noted for the lower skilled workers, which are more likely to be benefited by some collective bargaining, by some collective representation, they may not be as attractive to the labor union organizer, because the labor union organizer's negotiation with the firms are going to simply be tougher in order to secure a wage gain and minimize the loss in number of workers. It's interesting that in the U.S. economy, at the very least, that it is by and large the elastic worker, or the worker for which there's an elastic labor demand, that will be covered by a union. They need it most, but it's the hardest job for the union organizer, and the union organizer probably prefers them the least, whereas the inelastic workers need the union the least, but are preferred by the labor union organizers the most.